to thank you all for being here today. Professor Miller. It is an honor to have you here today at Tecnológico Monterrey and specifically at the School of Government and Public Transformation. The idea of this conference is for Professor Miller to give a brief talk, and then to start a discussion around the concept of future literacy and how to apply it in government and public transformation. And after that, we can open the session will be open for some questions of the audience. So feel free to ask through the chat through the chat, I think it's a better idea, or raising your hand. And I'm gonna introduce Professor Miller. Dr. Ian Miller is one of the world's leading authorities on the theory and practice of use in the future to change what people see and do. He's recognized as an innovative and globally experienced project initiator, designer, and manager. He's widely published in academic journals and other media on a range of topics, from the future of the internet to transforming strategic processes. He's an accomplished keynote speaker and facilitator. Professor Miller has worked as a senior manager in the Ontario Public Service in the areas of Ministry of Finance, Universities and Industry, and at the OECD in Paris in the areas of Economics, Science and Technology, Education, Territorial Development Center, and the International Features Program. In 2005, he founded a consultancy, Experidas, to advise clients on how to use the future more effectively. And in 2012, he was appointed head of foresight at UNESCO. Professor Miller has been focusing specifically on the dissemination of future literacy throughout the United Nations systems and worldwide ever since. He also has an important book in the area of future literacy, published by UNESCO and Routledge, that is called Transforming the Future, Anticipation in the 21st Century. So welcome, Professor Miller, and you are mute.
Unmute. Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction. Real pleasure to be here with you today, and very glad to be able to share some of the thinking that's going on around the world about how to integrate something that we all take for granted, to a certain extent, which is the future. We take it for granted, and I say that because almost everything we do involves the future, and yet we don't stand back to ask ourselves very often, what is the future? I mean, you can't touch it. What is it? And if we can determine what it is a little bit, how do we know it? Because of course, what something is a big part of also how we try to know about it. And that's why the title that I put forward for this talk is about detecting and creating novelty and understanding difference. And the future is central to that process because it orients, it guides what we are able to detect and how we make sense of what we detect. I mean, everybody's familiar with fight or flight, the reactions that we have when something confronts us. And I think it's pretty obvious that we make that kind of choice based on our perception. The perception comes first. Is this a threat that I should fight? Is it a threat that I should run away from? How do I react to that? That reaction is based on your perception. Is it going to overwhelm me? Am I defenseless and therefore I should run? And one of the things that we really haven't paid a lot of attention to is the way in which the image of the future we have, this expectation, this projection that we make that says, aha, this is something that I expect will be fatal, and therefore I should run. This expectation, this image of the future, is something we create. It's something that comes from our imagination. Because of course, if you're running and you think it's something fatal, you're not dead yet. So you don't actually know what's going to happen in the future. You're projecting something. And where does that projection come from? Who is responsible for that image that you have? the power of those expectations really cannot be underestimated. I just saw, just to make a reference to popular culture, I saw quite an interesting show. It's called The Premise. It just came out. It was on Hulu and all the rest. I think it's very recent, and it was absolutely an episode in which somebody convinces a whole group of people that he's going to do one thing when in fact he's going to do another. And it just shows you how powerful expectations and perceptions are. In this case, it was a very sad story about somebody who essentially commits suicide, but he does so by tricking the people who are around him into killing him. It's about gun control, and it's a very sad story about violence. But it just demonstrates the extent to which we are unable to really understand the sources and the power of our imagination. And futures literacy is really about enhancing that capability. I taught a course for 6 years at Sciences Po here in Paris, which was also part of London School of Economics and Columbia University. And it was about decision-making at the end of the administrative era. And one of the things to keep in mind, and I'm conscious here that you're, a School of Public Policy, interested and concerned with change and understanding change from a public policy perspective, is to realize that, the administrative era was preoccupied with planning, preoccupied with knowing and being able to control the future. And it's based on a premise which I think is in some ways a fundamentally false premise, and in fact a dangerous premise, that we are superior and so powerful that we can create the future. And of course, as many of you know, this is the slogan that's very familiar from Silicon Valley, that the best way, which comes from Arthur C. Clarke, actually a science fiction writer, that the best way to know the future is to create it, to determine it by what you do. And in fact, this is I think, an invitation for us to be arrogant, really, and also to, in some ways, cut ourselves off from the richness of the world around us. Because when we focus on what we can plan, what we can control, on setting up uncertainty as the enemy to being alive, we are actually sacrificing the richest part of the world around us. I don't need to point out to anybody today how fast a surprise can happen. Meaning COVID demonstrates to us that from almost one day to the next, expectations, behavior, the meaning of things can change. And I think it's actually a very good demonstration of the power of the future. I wrote a piece in the 1990s on the future of the internet, and I did this for the OECD. And 20 years later, one of the main things to notice was how slow change had been, how little had really happened. And in part that was because our ability to make use of the tools, and the tools were fantastic. What we could imagine, the potential of those tools was fantastic. But our ability to make use of that potential is shaped by our own expectations, our own behavior, our own codes and norms. And in this case, what the pandemic did is it simply broke the existing ways. It opened up and obliged, and it made necessity the mother of invention from the point of view of using the digital. What we're doing right now, which we could have done a year ago, 2 years ago, 10 years ago, but we didn't do it. And in that sense, it was already obviously a pity that we couldn't take advantage of the immense access offered by the internet, starting in the 1990s. But what was missing was our expectations, our ways of reinforcing power and hierarchy, our ability to invent new rituals for understanding each other and building trust. And all of these things, once again, are deeply connected to the images of the future that we have. So futures literacy explores these images of the future and tries to understand in greater analytical and theoretical detail, deeper understanding of where those images come from, why we invent those images, and tries to distinguish different kinds of futures, the futures that we look for, that we seek for different reasons in different ways. And by distinguishing those different futures and being able to understand the role that they play, we also are able to escape from some of the very, I think, dangerous and diminishing limitations that are created by the idea that we can colonize the future, that we can control the future. In fact, our ability to see things is confined by our fixation on saying, I want to make this happen, and therefore anything that's outside that doesn't compute. And in some ways, of course, that's very natural and normal. When I was crossing the street this morning coming to the office, of course, I focused quite carefully on the cars that were coming. And I wanted to see what the future would be when I crossed the street so I wouldn't get hit by a car. And so our survival, our anticipatory systems that we're so familiar with, they come out of these basic needs that we have to anticipate. Of course, being fed and having a baby cry to be fed are part of our survival mechanisms. Every living organism contains anticipatory systems. They function with anticipatory systems. But as we grow older and we move from these kind of very deterministic, simplistic anticipatory systems to the anticipatory systems of what does it mean to be a friend? Does somebody, when I put some clothes on, are they going to like me? That's an anticipatory act. I wear these clothes, I cut my hair. What are they going to think of me? What are they going to, in the future, think of me? And of course, we all know as we get older and have more experience that this is ambiguous, that there is no definitive answer, that you cannot know for sure. And that therefore, our anticipatory systems have to take into account novelty and emergence. And what's striking, I think, today is that the what we could call futures illiteracy, and I don't mean by that people don't use the future, but I mean they're not aware, they're not conscious of it. This inability to really distinguish the different reasons and ways of using the future deprive us in two crucial areas. One has to do with difference, and the other, I think, has to do with our relationship to the world around us. And with respect to difference, the issue here is how do you begin to invent and detect, intuit aspects of the world around you that didn't exist before, that don't have any name. Well, if you only stick with the dictionary of the past, you'll say, well, it's not in the dictionary of the past, so I'm not going to invent a new name for this new thing. Well, that's silly. And what's even worse is that, of course, humans are capable of inventing these new words. That's one of our great strengths. But we're very hesitant to do that. And we think our security is, well, I know that word already, so let me use it. And we have this idea of creating security by being certain, which of course sets us up for disappointment and sets us up for high levels of anxiety, because you know very well that the only certainty is uncertainty. And yet you're making uncertainty into an enemy. And so we're frightened. The other part has to do with being able to connect to the world around us. And in this sense, by over-investing in certainty and control, we actually take an approach to resilience, which is like building a castle. You build the castle, the fortress, to defend yourself. And when things change, you make bigger walls, higher walls. And then things change and you make even bigger and even higher walls. And then of course, at some point, that the walls will be too big and too thick, and then in any case, it will come from the sky and not from the sides, etc. And furthermore, at some point, you'll also say, my goodness, here I am in this castle. How come I can't go out into the world? Have I built myself a prison? And in this sense, we disconnect ourselves from the world around us. And the consequence of that is not only that we do things that are destructive, such as creating waste and ignoring the implications of carbon, etc. In other words, we're not prudent, we're not respectful of the fragility, but also the interdependence that we have with the world around us. But it, in some senses, deprives us from a much more effective strategy towards resilience, which is taking advantage of difference, a diversification strategy to change. And that, of course, it could be, and I don't know the future at all. And in some ways, I'm not that interested in the future. What I'm interested in is how the future influences my perception of the present first. After that, I will make bets and choices. But my perception as shaped by the future is what interests me most. But if I'm over-investing in one basket, I might actually make the right investment. I might have decided to build a fortress, and that's really the best way to survive. End of story. Who knows? But from the past, and that in the sense is important for us to understand because we live in this universe, diversification and the experimentation that is an evolutionary, emergent, creative world is a better bet, I think, from a strategic perspective. And so once again, futures literacy not only is an avenue to embracing the creativity of the universe around us and being more in tune with some of the values that we have around difference, meaning we want to respect, we want to understand, we want to embrace difference. But it also provides us fuel for the creativity that is essential for a diversification strategy to resilience. So I'll stop there. I think I've kind of touched on a lot of different subjects. It's I think fairly clear that adopting a futures literacy perspective really involves rethinking in some fundamental ways both the conception we have of human agency, but also the role of our institutions and the way in which we organize our survival, our existence. And so I can't tell you what it would be like to live in a different world. But what I can tell you is that the experience we have at UNESCO in acquainting people, in starting people off on a learning voyage where they begin to understand their own anticipatory systems, in other words, they become futures literate, is very positive, meaning people relate to something that they understand intuitively. And it's just like with reading and writing. If you say to a young child, you're able to speak, reading and writing is a way of augmenting or using your ability to speak and language in a different way. So too is futures literacy. It's a way of enhancing, augmenting something very innate to all humans, which is our capacity to anticipate, our capacity to use our imagination, but to do so in a way which really opens us up to the creativity and the splendor of our universe. And I think in some ways can also reduce our fears and our anxieties and allow us to find meaning in new ways.
Thank you. It's very interesting what you have told us and made me think about several things now that the forum is open for questions and answers. But I would like to ask you one first, because you make me think about one of the main ideas of this school is public transformation. The school name was changed around 10 years ago because we wanted to push the idea of public transformation. And that made me think about how can futures literacy can help to transform, especially in countries like Latin America, where we have some resistance to think creatively, and we are more used to plan and prepare, to predict or trying to predict what will happen and to prepare. And we are really like resistance to imagine and think of other methods that can be used in public policy design to think things differently. And maybe that it's stopping us for really transforming the futures of our countries, of our people. So I know that you have done this in other countries like South Africa. So maybe you can tell us a little more about that, of how do you think this concept of future literacy can help us as a Latin American country with all of our challenges and problems to trying to fix. Can this help us do that?
Thank you for the question, and it's a very important one. Of course, there's actually quite a few questions in what you were talking about. Let me begin with the idea of transformation. The interpretation that I have of, or the definition that I use of transformation, is that I cannot know transformation in advance. Meaning, if it's really a transformation, then, well, it's not something I can really understand today from where I am here. So the transition or the transformation from peasant agricultural society to urban industrial society, it's very difficult to imagine what that's like. It's a transformation, but it's very difficult for us to understand what it's like. I mean, I would almost say, that this happens in many different kind of ways. Of course, I've never given birth, but I've experienced, in my family, the children being born, and before and after, of course, is not the same. And if you said to somebody, "Well, I want you to tell me what it's like," as if you'd already had a child, and they say, "Well, I can't because I haven't actually experienced that transformative event." But what we can know is that we're in transition, meaning we know that we're leaving something, critiquing something, going beyond something, because that's something we know and that we can actually push off from, or flee, or break. And that can invoke transition. So transition, which may or may not generate transformation, is something we can understand. So I think that the key is to be aware of the need to identify the potential for transition. And there's many different sources of transition. And here's where futures literacy, I think, enters into the picture in quite an important way. When the noble person in a place called Bruges in Europe introduced a market inside the walls of his castle, he introduced this market with certain rules. And those rules were very effective for commerce. This was 500 years ago. When that noble was doing that, did he realize that he was planting the seeds of mercantilism that would lead to capitalism, with rules of transactions and property that were going to be fundamental for the capitalist system? No, they did not know. They were just doing things that made sense to them in their local context. What I'm saying here is that in emergent novelty, in a universe where difference and repetition are the characteristics of the world around us, there are things that emerge that are different, that might become big or might not. And we don't know in advance. So this implies that the strategy is to be experimentalist, to experiment with 1,000 seeds and 1,000 flowers. And some you bet on, and you think, this is the one that's going to really be big. But if you only bet on one, or only on two, or only on three, or if you're convinced that it's only in this part of the garden that things will grow, then you won't experiment and you won't be open. But experimentalism has something that's very contradictory, antithetical, disturbing from the point of view of planning and certainty, which is it's full of failure. Experiments, you learn from failure. And if you embrace an experimentalist approach, many things will never become big. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But if you're fixated on scale, if you're fixated on the industrial era's idea of status and success, then you will be obsessed with the idea of making the right bet, the good bet, and you won't be very experimentalist. Now, the interesting thing is that organisms, and by this I mean companies or communities or governments or nations, organisms will try to do their best to achieve what they can, to be immortal, to live forever. and they will try to make all their bets to stay alive. In the overall wholeness, many of them will fail. Many of them will die. Birth and death are essential to a healthy ecosystem. If the dinosaurs hadn't died, maybe there wouldn't be humans. Birth and death are fundamental to these processes. So what I'm suggesting here is that from the perspective of the nation state, from the perspective of leadership, the issue is not so much, do I know the future? Can I be immortal? But can I create the conditions for diversity, for experimentation, for difference, for understanding and communicating the meaning of difference and change? It's a way of thinking about the world around us that I think, to a certain extent, is more humble. And from my experiences, and we've done many futures literacy labs in Latin America, in Chile, in Uruguay, in Ecuador, in Mexico, these futures literacy laboratories, which are experiential processes, illustrate to people, demonstrate to people that they can let go of the way that they've been using the future in the past and open themselves up to taking advantage of one of the great strengths of Latin America, which is your diversity and your differences. And it's not so much the question of how do you go to scale, how do we plan things so we can be the best, the biggest, the fastest, the whatever, but really, can you find meaning? And here I would also go to the economic side of things. Can you find value, and not just financial value, but life-sustaining value in ways that are open to what your community cares about? And I would just point out, again, to make the link to futures literacy, that what your community cares about is shaped by its image of the future. I care that we have the highest skyscraper in the world. I care that we imitate Silicon Valley. I care that we should be the leaders in the fourth industrial revolution. Where did that image of the future come from? Who does that speak to in your community? Why do they care about those things? And if you think about what they might care about, in other words, what a future that originates from their own world, their own context, then we begin to tap into a capability-based approach to the future, a capability-based approach to development, which is radically different from the goal-oriented, planning-based, we should hit the targets, ex-ante, results-based thinking. Again, this is not a simple process because it's a big change, but I think that you're very well equipped, in part for historical reasons, to take a more humble and more open approach to development than the one that says we should all look like New York City.
Talking about that, about how to teach or how to, because we're a school and we have a master's degree program in strategic foresight. So we have been teaching future studies. So I've read your book and I understood it. I don't know if I understood it correctly, but as you said, future studies, it's a focus in anticipation for the future, not necessarily anticipation for emergence. That I think you are talking about, like being open to different futures. So they have taught us for many years that we should have a vision, that we should teach our students to prepare and to plan. So my big question here is, if we want to teach our students to be open for emergence and for novelty, and I'm making a connection here that maybe we have to teach them also to be more local, not so global, because change comes from the bottom up. So how can we teach them that, given that the whole system pushes for anticipation for the future and not necessarily for anticipation for emergence? And how can future studies as a field can transform to include this kind of vision, given that it's not, we think I have thought about it, and I think that future literacy shouldn't be like I'm future literate, or I'm not future literate. So, and it is, if it is like reading and writing, you get better by practicing, right? So how can you keep practicing future literacy if you outside this idea of future literacy labs? I don't know if I'm making sense here.
No, very, very much so. And it's a wonderful set of questions. And to go to the first one, because there were a few there. The first one about, how does change happen? And what's the relationship between visioning and so something we're familiar with, anticipation for the future and anticipation for emergence? I mean, I've been asking that question myself, in what I do for many, many years now. And I think it's important to walk the talk in the sense of saying is that I don't believe that we decided to be globalized. I don't believe we decided to be, a world where some people like representative democracy, some people don't. I don't think we decided those things. We didn't decide to create the industrial era school in the sense that these things were invented. And they were invented in ways that then diffused and survived in ecosystem terms. They were effective or not effective. They responded or they didn't respond. And they were just like anything else. They were the outcome of complex emergence. They were not planned. They were not determined by some genius. They were not imposed. We live in a universe that is emergent. And so if you ask the question, which I understand and I care about, just I think like you, which is, if we're currently dominated by anticipation for the future, let's say I live in a world where most people believe the earth is flat. The earth is flat. And then I see evidence, and I think it makes more sense to not only believe the earth is round, but also that the way of thinking that helps me to understand that the earth is round also makes more sense. So it's both recognition of what is the world and how to think about the world. So anticipation for emergence is a bit like that. It says the world isn't exactly as you were thinking it was. You thought it was flat, now it's round, and you need to think about it differently. Nobody will determine whether we make that transition or not. I don't think that's the way it happens. But what I can observe is that humans are being confronted by things like climate change, where the planet is telling us, not consciously, the planet doesn't care, but our relationship to the planet is telling us something is broken, something doesn't work. And I think we can say, look, it's not really that it's broken, it's just that I'm deficient. I'm going to be better. I'm going to come up with the best policy, the best reform, and I'm going to fix it. And this is just a question of better problem solving. I think that there are many humans who are realizing that that way of thinking might be one of the reasons we're in this difficulty, because it turns us into gods in a way. We have to be so good, so perfect. Our tools, which become magic, in artificial intelligence or whatever, will save us, because the geniuses will invent the tool, a little bit like magic, that will save us. All of these ways of thinking, I think, are being called into question at a very profound level, not by what we're saying here at UNESCO, not by what is being taught, at a university, but by all of it that is confronting this world around us, where we're being forced to experiment with new ways of using the future. And I think that it's common from the historical record that, for instance, certain breakthroughs in technology are invented at the same time in many different places. There's, I think, a hypothesis about human language, that the language, that speaking, emerged in many different parts of the world in roughly the same period of time. In other words, I believe fundamentally that the conditions may or may not be fertile, that the garden may or may not give rise to those plants. But what I can do personally, and what we can do in schools and in education, is to encourage, to fertilize, to be open to something we don't understand, to acknowledge our ignorance, to take a strategic position which does not say, I was the dominant force, my idea was the dominant idea, therefore I'm going to do everything I can to stay on top of the pyramid and be the strongest. This is, I think, one of the fundamental problems with most human civilizations. We build monuments and we create systems in which we reproduce systems that have worked. So it's not that we invented them, but they are something we live, that says, if I want to remain in power, I want to be able to use this idea that because I know the past, and in the past I was in power, we're safe in the future because I know the past. So reproduce the past into the future. And that way I'll stay in power and you'll stay safe because we know it. We have certainty. This whole way of thinking privileges continuity, privileges path dependency, creates a heavy monumentalist. Why do we build pyramids? Why do we build pyramids? You have beautiful pyramids in Mexico. We have incredible pyramids in Egypt. Why do we build pyramids? What is this about immortality that is at the core of our thinking about value and status? These are things that we need to question. And I don't have an answer or a solution, but I think they are things we can experience and your students can experience in their own life in many ways. And I'll end with this point, which is that the challenge, I think, which is not a new challenge, is really about how to be wise. What do we do to create contexts where wisdom emerges? And I think we know that that comes from experience. It comes from learning hard lessons and joyful lessons. It comes from loss and from gain, from birth and death. It comes from change. And that means we need to create environments where that kind of learning, wisdom, and the joy, the pleasure of wisdom is more central. And I don't think that that's impossible. I think we're fairly far away from that right now. But there are a lot of indigenous cultures, and Mexico, again, has many lessons to teach in that regard, that understand some aspects of that. And I think there, again, we can share and learn together. So for me, it's, again, I'll go back to the experimentalist approach. It's about encouraging and learning from constant experimentation.
Okay, thank you. I think we have some questions from the audience. I'm going to read it to you. So one of the questions is it really possible in practice to create a future without leaving any of the parties out, especially the historically violated communities, without compromising the future for all? Example, indigenous peoples who are governed by their autonomy and do not follow the trend of globalization?
It's a very, very important question. And in many ways, you'll forgive me a kind of a Star Trek, the principle of non-interference, of remaining outside, in the end is in some ways the only answer to not violating, because contamination is contamination and it's irrevocable. But we live on a small planet, and we're gregarious social creatures. And so, of course, there's been much violation, and that violation has been fatal, and sometimes purposefully fatal, so morally reprehensible. And that's the fact of the world we live in. The question of whether or not we could create a world of assemblages, meaning non-hierarchical, non-necessarily dependent or interdependent units, is an open question. I think we're not capable of that yet, meaning so much of what we do to just organize daily life in today's world makes it impossible for us to function without hierarchy and without unequal power. But I don't think it's inherently impossible to imagine a way of functioning where we would be able to privilege the idea of heterarchy. Heterarchy is the opposite of hierarchy. And heterarchy can be easily, I think, understood when you say a hierarchy is if somebody's rich and somebody's poor, if somebody has a diploma and somebody doesn't, if you're at the top of the mountain or the bottom of the mountain, whatever. But you can't make the same kind of hierarchical claim about happiness. My happiness is higher than your happiness, is bigger, is better. No, my happiness is mine and your happiness is yours. And that's all there is to it. And because so much of the world around us is hierarchical, really, and the things often that we care about the most are hierarchical, not hierarchical. There is the spark, and I only say spark for me, of imagining a world in which heterarchy is as intelligible and meaningful as hierarchy is today. Almost everything we do is structured, colored by hierarchy. And of course, we understand that from a planning perspective, from a control the future perspective, hierarchy makes perfect sense. And particularly if we say the only way we can be safe is by killing uncertainty, and the only way to kill uncertainty is to have command and control, and the only way to have command and control is to have hierarchy, because I command and you do, where you can see how the system functions. So I don't have an answer to that at all. But what I can say is that I can think in transitional terms, as I mentioned before. I can think in terms of the critique, and I can think in terms of what we might go towards. I don't know what that towards will be like, actually, because of course we're not there yet. But I do believe that it is conceivable that we could live in assemblage, hierarchical ways that privilege meaning and well-being, and in that way, might be able to respect non-interference. Maybe.
Thank you. We have here another question. I want to ask if we are to challenge these images of the future and seek to shift the possibilities collectively of what we are to achieve in this uncertainty context, how can we strengthen the link between these individual images of the future that may be innovative to be shared enough to generate collective action from a social or public policy perspective? Mainly taking into consideration that some of these possible futures, innovative futures, will not be generated from existing power structure, but rather from outcasts in the system.
A very, very important question. Essentially, there's a dividing line between. It's part of the answer here is what I would call walking on two legs, meaning that we do things that are based on planning and making bets, and we know very well from good public policy, which has a collective characteristic to it, where you have what I'm Canadian, and in Canada we understand as participatory policy formation. You formulate the policy in a participatory way. People share the process for articulating the objective. And initially, of course, you start with plural objectives. And in some ways, this is just good practice from the perspective of strategic foresight, for instance, to create a participatory process with plural futures, and whereby those plural futures get narrowed down and certain choices get made, and you can pursue the future on the basis of a shared perspective. Firms, companies, schools, all sorts do this all the time, and they have to do it all the time because they need to make bets, and they're going to plan, and they're going to work together. And we're actually pretty good at doing this, more or less. The other leg, though, is the one that has to do with anticipation for emergence, where we don't know and where we're improvising. And in one way, you can just think of one leg as being planning and the other leg being improvisation. Now, improvisation is not planning, and planning is not improvisation. Of course, you can plan in ways that enhance improvisation, and of course, improvisation can benefit planning. Because it gives you the ability to do new things, and it confirms that you can explore and innovate in real time. And so the issue here in part is understanding that we have overdeveloped one leg. So we have one very, very strong leg, and I call it, we hop around on this very strong leg. But if you liberate the other leg and you let it also go down, right now it's very weak. Okay, so we fall over and we don't trust it and we don't know it, and the world doesn't work that way. But gradually, as people become more futures literate, perhaps, and we become stronger in using the other leg, we have more agility. We have two legs, planning and improvisation, which doesn't resolve the issue. And if you've ever watched a baby learning to walk, you understand the issue, which is even if you get one leg working and the other leg working, what's the relationship between the two? How do I get this balance going? And so, of course, we have quite a challenge in understanding that, first of all, one leg is atrophied, that our imagination, the humble imagination of anticipation for emergence, is underdeveloped, that we don't understand how to make that stronger yet. We're working on it. How does that relate then to the strong leg of planning? And what will it mean when we're really able to get all three working? One leg, the other leg, and the relationship between the two. So I think, from the perspective of what a young person today trying to think about how to use futures thinking, this offers quite a wide range of directions for experimentation.
Okay, in relation to that, I think we have here a question is, if we had to measure emergence competencies and future literacy competency, are there any difference in the ways these different competencies are captured?
No, a very, very good question, and quite a tricky one in some ways, because measurements very important. My trainings as an economist, and I worked at national income accounting, and I believe accounting is a very powerful mechanism, maybe one of the most powerful mechanisms we have, because it's the basis for budgeting, and budgeting is one of the strongest sources of inertia in the current system. We've done surveys which look at whether people have changed the way they feel about uncertainty before and after a futures literacy lab, and clearly they do. People become, because they experience it, right? A futures literacy lab is a living lab. It's action learning, it's action research, and people actually experience what it's like to become more futures literate. It's like learning the alphabet and reading your first word. You actually experience, I don't know how many of you have been, it's really fantastic to be there when a child reads their first word. They see it on the street or in the subway or in the table and somewhere, and they go, that's, and, or whatever it happens to be. And so we have that kind of data, and we've experienced it. We have evidence that people can become more futures literate. But as you may know, and thank you, you made reference to the book, Transforming the Future. There's a framework there that tries to categorize different types of ways of thinking about the future. And we're only at the beginning of starting to attribute whether people are doing what we call anticipatory assumption 1, anticipatory assumption 4, and these different spheres. And so we're at the beginning of, I think, an important scientific undertaking, which is not unfamiliar. It's the very basic. I mean, you can remember, everybody knows that in physics, there was a theory of what might be a particle, or what might be this subatomic particle, but there was no evidence yet. They couldn't see it. They had to build very big, expensive accelerators and things like that to test their ideas. So today, we're still in the beginning in many ways. This was also true, by the way, and just to point out that when we started to say everybody should learn to read and write. Well, if you say that everybody should learn to read and write, well, how are you going to do that? And what is it? And how are we going to measure what's going on? And of course, it's taken us many years, and we still have a very difficult time evaluating learning. It's not an easy thing to do. And since futures literacy is fundamentally a capability, and it's a capability that's applied in context, I'm a great believer in formative assessment, not summative assessment, meaning our ability to feel that it's meaningful and useful in context. And, in that sense, the learning of a baby is as good as the learning of a Nobel Prize winner, because for them it's a huge leap. It's their big breakthrough. And if they're learning the little things that babies learn, it's magnificent. And the same, of course, is true for somebody who has a great invention or a genius. But here we're talking about ways of measuring, I think, that are related, and I'll go back to the term, to wisdom. And I think each of us can be wise in our own way. I don't think, again, that there's a hierarchical version of wisdom, which means that the way of thinking about evaluation also needs to change, to not just be hierarchical.
I have just a quick question just to clarify a little bit about this. When you define futures literacy, you define it as the ability to consciously use the future.
Yeah.
So this means that in order to be futures literate, you have to be able to anticipate for the future and to anticipate for emergence, or since they have taught us for years to anticipate for the future only, we can say that we are future literate if we are able to consciously use the future, although we have a resistance to use the future for emergence.
Look, I mean, I have to say that I think that we, in some senses, are focused on the wrong issue, meaning scenarios, images of the future, are a dime a dozen. I mean, they're just cheap. I mean, we're kind of, every day you create 10 new ones or 100 new ones, right? And this fixation with, you know, did Blade Runner get it right? Was Philip K. Dick, who, you know, wrote the, is that the image of the future that's, you know, everybody should bet on or believe in? Is making the world great again the image of the future that makes the most sense? You know, I think that the issue of futures literacy is really, do we understand why we're imagining and how we're imagining, which are processes that we engage in constantly. And the images of the future are actually throwaway. They're for different purposes, different reasons. You forget immediately why you calculated your trajectory across the street. You don't remember that and say, oh, that image of how I crossed the street is something I need to remember. No, you know, you store it in your experience, of course. But the point that I'm making here is that we're much too fixated on the top of Mount Everest. That's my goal. I imagined it. I have the vision of it. Therefore, I must go there. That's, you know, who runs their life by some ex-ante vision? And again, you know, it's true that when you're a young child, you will look to your older brother, your older sister, your mother, your father, your heroes, and you'll say, I want to be just like them. And you will set a goal and you will say, this is how I should be. But we all know that relatively quickly, you understand that you're your own person, that you're not them, and you can't be like them. And so do you keep that image of the future in your mind and say, oh, I wanted to be like them, I wanted to be like them, but you'll be miserable. You know, you won't be happy. And you have to understand that, of course, that's just not the way our reality functions. You cannot reproduce. And that, I mean, I find that funny about, you know, the clones. A clone might be physically similar, but their conditions and their way of living are totally different. They're not the same person. So I think that here, when we think about futures literacy, in a way, we need to use an anticipatory systems perspective on what is the future. And your question in part reflects an anticipation for the future way of thinking, which is normal, like we've said. But once you adopt an alternative way of thinking, the image of the future becomes less important. Personally, I don't care about the future. Like I said, I care about how the future influences what I think, what I feel, my hopes, my fears, what I'm able to perceive. Is my image of the future denying me the capacity to appreciate, to imagine the potential of something I've never seen before? Difference. And if the future is denying me that possibility, then I'm not using the future the right way.
Okay, I hope that we have a little minutes for one last question, because we have a bunch of questions here. So I will ask you this last question. What will be your advice to create incentives for local rulers engaged in day-to-day administration to adopt future literacy in public policy? And on a political scale, how optimistic are you about the future in terms of economic systems? That's it. Last question.
Yeah, beautiful. Look, I'm not a great believer, and I don't think it makes much sense to ask the leopard to change its spots. Meaning, the founding myth of a company, the founding myth of the nation state, that's immortal, forever, glorious, that originally came from the king, and the king was God, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, look, for us to grow out of that, to become more mature, is going to take some time. But I don't think we can transform those old things into something totally different. They die. And I think birth and death are crucial parts of all this. So to a certain extent, I understand entirely that we need to allow change to happen over time through generations. I know that I need to die so that I liberate, and my legacy does not impose, and my presence does not impose on the imagination and the way of doing things that people in the future will care about. They will have different values. They will be in a different context. So convincing the current leaders to find some way to be immortal is not something that I'm that, enthusiastic about. I think that what we can do often, though, is offer more generosity and make the case for being more tolerant of birth. Because those that are in power and dominating say, I want to stay at the top, I want to be immortal, and my responsibility is to always be, the one who decides. And that to me is ungenerous. To me, that is inhibiting of the experimentation and of birth and of the future. And so the idea for me is to be able to take a strategic position which does not try to stifle potential and to nurture difference. With respect to optimism, pessimism, I think optimism, pessimism depends a lot on, how much you slept and, whether you had a good traffic jam or a bad traffic jam. And I don't think optimism or pessimism actually has that much meaning. I think optimism and pessimism relate more to decision making, and decision making is a betting proposition. And much of what I've been talking about is about perception. So let me translate it into these terms. I like to go to a restaurant that has lots of items on the menu and many items that I don't know. Am I optimistic that the one that I don't know will please me? Well, if I order it, I'm optimistic. If I don't order it, well, maybe I was pessimistic about it, But the crucial thing is the menu and my attitude towards the diversity on the menu. And then sometimes I'm optimistic about trying something new because who cares? Something I'm yearning for, something I'm familiar with because I'm feeling, disrupted or disgruntled. Optimism and pessimism are related to decision making. Will the horse win? Will it not win? Etc. But I don't think that they're crucial from the point of view of anticipatory systems, which are really fundamental to perception. Choice is another universe.
Well, time's up. So many thanks for your participation. I hope to have you again, to have the opportunity to talk again with you. I know that you have another conference at Tech. Tech is a big system, so we are a little part of it. So thank you, and let's continue a conversation if that's possible.
Absolutely. I'm very much looking forward to working with you and the chair at Tech. And with you and your colleagues, I think absolutely we can create a very productive and rich ecosystem together.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for your participation here. Thank you everyone for connecting.
Estamos preparados para este mundo de cambios, siempre avanzando y anticipando lo que viene.
Con una innovadora oferta educativa que te prepara para enfrentar a los nuevos retos que surgen día a día.
Y dar soluciones que trascienden y cambian el panorama.
Que te da herramientas tecnológicas para empoderar a los más vulnerables. Con profesores que llevarán su experiencia dentro y fuera del salón de clases.
Todo para que juntos dejemos un lugar mejor.
Mientras unos esperan una nueva realidad,
Nosotros ya la estamos construyendo. ¿Te unes? El mundo cambió.
nosotros también.